Chapter 30. Victor Lee turned the hand wheel to seal the hatch of the Death Witch's bunker. Lizard, Sig, Row 82, Jonathan, and Kirana had already passed through. Normally he would not have bothered, but Row 82 and Jonathan had confirmed that Lucas was in the facility as well. Victor had a hunch that Lucas may have been closing them for a reason, although no one else confirmed it. "They're being held in separate areas," said Row 82. "There's been a lot of discussion about luring fit men," said Jonathan. "They've got some kind of broadcast of the women going on." Victor and Sig looked at one another with a silent understanding. Victor had been unlike other bounty hunters, as he had consistently taken jobs that allowed him to put an end to this very sort of exploitation. Sig had actually not had a large amount of bounty hunting experience. He was more of a pirate, but he had also ensured that his targets were the sort of sadists that sought fortune in victimizing those that were least able to defend themselves. Although they had traveled to a time centuries before either of them would be born, the feeling that they were in a foreign time had all but vanished. The world of ice and fire was new to Miranda Drake, but it was familiar to Sig and Victor, and it gave the sensation that they were fighting on their home turf. "Should we free the women first?" asked Row 82 innocently. "Do you think that the women can't handle themselves?" asked Kirana angrily. "Since they're all in prison, it seems like they are all equally unable to handle themselves," said Row 82 calmly. Kirana opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. "Actually," said Victor as he looked back briefly toward the hatches that he had resealed, "I think it would be a good idea to get Lucas. I have a feeling he was already working on a strategy." "Sounds good," said Sig with a smile. The group rushed down the hallway. At first, Row 82 and Jonathan tried to provide warnings for upcoming groups of patrols, but having Lizard around meant that disabling the enemies went almost just as quick as giving warnings. The sound of Augment's screams every couple of minutes brought a smile to Sig's face. Before long, they had arrived in front of a hatch with a large hand wheel. Row 82 and Jonathan pointed to it as they approached, confirming it was the place where Lucas was being held. "Carson Price is in there with him," said Jonathan in a tone of confusion. "What's he doing?" asked Victor. "He's waving at us through the wall," said Row 82 in an equally confused tone. Victor shook his head as he turned the hand wheel. After a few moments, the thick door had loosened enough that Victor could swing it open. As they looked inside, they saw Carson in his big gray robe waving cheerfully at them, just as Row 82 predicted. "You've all made it," said Carson with his jagged yellow smile. He turned to Lucas, who sat on the floor with a frown. "I told you it would work out." "Are you okay, Lucas?" asked Lizard. Lucas was sitting on the floor holding his knees close to his chest and his head down. Even with the bright lighting on the white walls, ceiling, and floor, his sullen expression made everything appear dimmer than it was. "I don't know," said Lucas slowly. "They've got Stephanie and Jennifer." "And Angelica," said Carson cheerfully. Kirana shot Carson a look of disapproval. The smile on his face faded, and he took a step back. "We're supposed to have the ability to see the future and the past," said Lucas. "We were totally blindsided by the Death Witch." "I thought you were the demon prophet," said Lizard with a smirk as he turned to Carson. "You really are the funny one," said Carson with a laugh. "Sarah Hawkins was right." The smirk on Lizard's face turned to one of annoyance as Sig laughed with the demon master. "Yeah, why didn't you see her coming?" said Kirana angrily. Carson's laugh disappeared suddenly, and he cowered back like a frightened animal. "And you are the scary one," whispered Carson nervously. Sig laughed loudly at his reaction. Carson gave Sig a look of horror. "Oh, I guess you can laugh because you have Heaven's shield," said Carson. "She's not going to hurt you," said Sig with a laugh. "Oh, that's a relief," said Carson with a laugh. "I never said that," said Kirana in a low voice. Carson backed up again, but his back hit the wall. He jumped with a start and whirled around before realizing he had backed into the wall. He turned to face Sig, and the two of them burst out laughing. "The question was valid," said Row 82 impatiently. "Why didn't you see what would happen?" "Well, a couple of things," said Carson as he stopped laughing. "First of all, the black keys are losing efficiency. Fewer sacrifices available and increased distance between us and the original demon keys have made them slightly less reliable. The other thing is that the future is always in flux. Even Sarah Hawkins gets the order wrong sometimes. Miranda just appeared there by chance." "Well, that is unfortunate luck, then," said Row 82. "As part of the reason that the Syndicate pushed survival of the fittest," explained Carson. "We knew we would need revolutionary ideas to survive after the Demon Lords went into hiding. Angelica's tournament, even the alliance between major sections that had been devoted to Demon Lords. Everything was new and different." "So what's our next move?" asked Sig as he turned to Lucas. "I don't know if it will work anymore," said Lucas. "I had counted on knowing where everyone was going to be." The room fell silent for several moments. The lack of confidence seemed to make everything feel colder and darker. "There is no destiny," said Victor calmly. His voice was not loud, but its clarity conveyed confidence that made the others turn to face him and listen. "But there is strategy." Silence lasted a few more moments as Lucas thought about what Victor had said. "You're right," said Lucas at last. He got to his feet and looked at the others. He had been in more difficult circumstances with fewer resources, and difficult circumstances had never stopped him from finding the most efficient method for dealing with whatever problem he had faced. A smile appeared on his lips, and the melancholy that had permeated the room was dispelled. "This is gonna be good," said Sig with a wide smile to Carson. He laughed as Lucas began to unfold his plan. Stephanie and Jennifer had scratches on their arms and legs, but Angelica had dried blood on her upper lip. Angelica was lying on the floor, gasping for breath. Jennifer and Stephanie had backed up defensively, but they were both breathing heavily as well. The muffled sound of cheering from the other side of the one-way mirror had diminished as the action of the fight had stopped, and was replaced with repeated tapping sounds. Their audience was eager to see more blood, or more skin, or both. Notwithstanding their offers to avoid fighting, Angelica had smiled widely and lunged at Jennifer, fueling the clawing, hitting, and kicking that had occupied the past several hours. Though Angelica had fought tenaciously, she was not able to sufficiently attack one opponent without opening herself up to the other. Eventually, Stephanie had been able to grab Angelica's head and knee her in the nose. Angelica had been stunned enough by the attack that several well-placed hits by Jennifer and Stephanie forced her to the floor. As she struggled to get up, Stephanie slammed her heel into the center of Angelica's back. Her forehead slammed against the floor. Though her back was rising and falling to indicate she was breathing, it was clear that she had lost consciousness. The tapping on the one-way mirror increased, and as Jennifer and Stephanie looked toward it, the repeated shaking of the window made their reflections contort slightly, almost as though they were seeing themselves in a pool of water whose surface was troubled by the wind. As much as the sound was muffled by the wall, the two of them could discern their audience chanting the words, "Kill her." They looked at one another. Of course, they were still exhausted from the prolonged fight. The sweat on their arms and foreheads glistened in the artificial light. They both had their hands on their hips as their breathing calmed. The cuts and bruises on their necks and faces suddenly became a new priority as the salt of their sweat ran across their injuries. Stephanie's lower lip had swollen up, and Jennifer realized blood was dripping from her nose. Jennifer turned to the bed nearest her and grabbed a portion of the sheet, then pinched it over her nose. Stephanie sat down next to her. After a moment, the sound of their disappointed crowd ceased. They looked at one another with worry. Sparring Angelica had not only seemed to be the moral choice, but it had given them a degree of satisfaction to spite the audience that had cheered at their pain. Their sudden silence was chilling. Stephanie and Jennifer wanted to look toward the one-way mirror, but they knew they would not be able to see what was happening on the other side. Stephanie imagined a throng of men making their way to the door. She imagined that men who had donated enthusiastically to Miranda Drake's cause had been promised access to the survivors, and now that they were exhausted, they were even more vulnerable. She longed for some tools with which she could unfasten the bed from the floor and prop it against the door to barricade themselves. Jennifer felt her eyelids growing heavy. She was also dehydrated, and now that the fight was over, the adrenaline seemed to have worn off. Of course, the sudden silence of their spectators bothered her, but she could not help but think the bed on which she sat seemed more comfortable than it had previously. She took the sheet away from her face and brushed her finger against her nose to see if the bleeding had stopped. As she examined her finger, she realized that the blood on it was dry. She breathed a sigh of relief. Stephanie gave her a puzzled look, wondering how she could look so calm when the danger was so great. "What?" whispered Jennifer. Before Stephanie could respond, the door burst open. Jennifer jumped with a start, and Stephanie leapt back onto the bed defensively. Miranda Drake walked into the room by herself. "You did not finish your work," she said. Jennifer was too exhausted to respond. "Why didn't you kill her?" demanded Miranda. "She was obviously willing to kill you." Stephanie shook Jennifer's shoulder to try and prompt her to say something. Having experienced the wrath of slavers that demanded a response, she knew that sometimes a quick, humble response was the best method for turning away wrath. Had she known what Jennifer would say, she would have gladly taken her chances with silence. "Because survival of the fittest is stupid," said Jennifer with a weary smirk. Stephanie's eyes widened. Miranda Drake's narrowed. The sound of the glass being hit let them know that their audience was still watching on the other side of the one-way mirror, and that they found Jennifer's comment distasteful. The situation seemed to last an eternity to Stephanie. She longed for her key. Though the visions that it forced upon her were frequently confusing and troubling, she decided that she hated not having any idea of what was going to happen. She shuddered as she watched Miranda clench her fists. The Death Witch spun around and walked out the door, which slammed shut loudly. Stephanie grabbed Jennifer's shoulders and turned her to face her. If she had been able to speak, she would have screamed at her, but she could only mouth the words, "What were you thinking?" Jennifer laughed softly. "I don't know," she said softly. "I'm just really tired." Stephanie frowned, but before she could do anything else, the door swung open and Miranda rushed back into the room, brandishing a long ice pick. Jennifer and Stephanie got to their feet and backed up defensively. "This is what will happen," said Miranda in a low voice. "Since you are so opposed to eliminating the unfit, you will be responsible for the unfit." Jennifer's eyes narrowed as Miranda knelt down next to Angelica and grabbed her forehead. Miranda jammed her ice pick into Angelica's face just above her eye and twisted it around. Jennifer gasped and stumbled back into Stephanie. The muffled sounds of cheering from the one-way mirror behind them echoed through the room. You, stammered Jennifer. "I'm performing a lobotomy," said Miranda in a solemn tone. She pulled out the ice pick and jammed it above the other eye to repeat the process. "You will be responsible for caring for Angelica Sterling from now on. You will see to her needs. When she dies, you will die. You demanded that the unfit survive. Your fate is now bound to this. We'll see how stupid you think survival of the fittest is after you suffer without it." Jennifer and Stephanie looked on in horror as Miranda pulled her ice pick out of Angelica's face and got to her feet. "We'll see who looks stupid now," said Miranda in a low voice. "You do," came a voice from behind her. She spun around. "Carson Price," she said. "Miranda, you're all by yourself," said Carson with his yellow smile. "I don't need anyone else," said Miranda calmly. "You know I can heal any injury you can inflict." "That's not exactly true," said Carson. "I have foreseen your death. You will not leave this room alive." "The time for false prophecy is at an end," said Miranda. "We no longer need to put faith into what might be. No one can see the future." Muffled cheering erupted from behind the one-way mirror as she raised her ice pick defensively. Carson laughed as he drew a curved knife. "Please," laughed Carson. "I don't even need my key to predict your movements." He leaned out of the way of a lunging attack and jumped to the side to avoid a follow-up attempt. "You speak as though you did not have a predictable weakness yourself," said Miranda coldly. She looked down at Angelica. "You have always lusted after the fire demon master." She lunged toward Angelica with her ice pick, but Carson slashed at her wrist, parrying her arm away. Her eyes grew dark as the lacerated flesh on her arm weaved together. "Take her out of here," shouted Carson to Stephanie and Jennifer. Though they were not pleased with the idea of heeding Carson Price's instructions, they preferred listening to him to taking their chances with the demon witch. Carson lunged at Miranda, throwing her back. Jennifer and Stephanie used the opportunity to rush toward Angelica and drag her out of the open door. Miranda leapt up and lunged after them, but was stopped by Carson's blade being jammed into her abdomen. She staggered back and then turned her attention to Carson. "I thought you didn't need anyone else," chided Carson. "I don't," said Miranda as she straightened her back and healed her wound, "including an audience." Carson's face turned pale as she turned toward the one-way mirror. "No," whispered Carson in horror. "The ladies are yours for the taking, gentlemen," shouted Miranda. The sound of muffled cheering and commotion came and died down as the spectators rushed out of the room to claim their prize. "You will pay for this," thundered Carson. "What will you do? Stab me?" chided Miranda. She lunged again at Carson. He easily avoided the attack and spun around, delivering a kick to the side of Miranda's head. She staggered to the side and fell over. "No," said Carson with half a smile. "I'm going to keep you in your cell." Miranda's eyes grew wide with terror as she realized that she was in no position to keep Carson in the room with her anymore. He rushed out the door and slammed it shut, cutting the sound of Miranda's screaming short. Outside the room, Jennifer and Stephanie were dragging Angelica down the hall. Carson caught up with them quickly. "What now?" demanded Jennifer. "I don't know exactly," said Carson. "Lucas Flynn was determined to be done with the syndicate once and for all, though." "Lucas is here?" gasped Jennifer. Stephanie smiled as hope filled her heart. Jennifer was obviously still skeptical. "That little kid better have a good idea." "Could you be referring to this little kid?" called an augment from behind them as he tossed Lucas in front of them. Stephanie could immediately tell that he was still conscious. Even without the benefit of her divine key, she knew that he did have a good idea. She smiled, in spite of their circumstances, eager to see the brilliant strategy of which he had thought come to life and decimate their enemies. The corners of Lucas's mouth turned slightly. It was time to act. He lifted his head and opened his eyes. As the sight of Jennifer and Stephanie in satin underwear greeted him, his cheeks turned bright red and his jaw dropped open. He wanted to move, or to at least look away, but his neck would not turn, his eyelids would not close, and his limbs seemed frozen in place. "Lucas?" whispered Jennifer. Said Lucas, unable to make any coherent sound. At last he forced himself to turn away and face the augment that had thrown him down. "Kirana!" shouted Lucas. There was a loud gunshot, and the augment that had grabbed Lucas slumped to the ground. The augments coming from behind Carson and the women came thundering down the hall as Kirana appeared. "What's your problem, Lucas?" shouted Kirana angrily. Lucas's face turned red again. Kirana looked and noticed Jennifer and Stephanie, and then frowned. "What do you think you're doing running around in your underwear?" shouted Kirana. Jennifer and Stephanie looked at one another in surprise. "How is Lucas supposed to focus on the strategy when you two are running around like a couple of augment wenches?" "It's not our fault that we had our clothes taken," shouted Jennifer angrily. Carson scooped Angelica up off of the floor. As entertaining as this is, we've got to go, said Carson. Kirana took off her long white coat and handed it to Stephanie. You put this on, said Kirana angrily. What about me? Asked Jennifer. Shut up, shouted Kirana. Get moving. Stephanie wrapped the coat around her as they ran down the hall away from the horde of augments. Sig came into view. He took off his large coat and handed it to Jennifer, who quickly wrapped it around her. Better? Asked Kirana as she turned to Lucas. Much, thank you, said Lucas softly. Sorry about that, What was your plan? Asked Jennifer in an irritated tone. Attacking their confidence, said Lucas. Their belief in their superiority fuels their will to fight. How are you going to do that? Asked Jennifer skeptically. Lucas took a deep breath and smiled confidently. Sig and Carson laughed loudly as the augments approached. Sig raised his shield and they crashed into it. One of the augments had a blade sticking out of his wrist and impaled the augment in front of him. There was a brief moment of chaos as the augments fought among themselves, until a large augment with a bright orange tuft of hair sticking up out of his otherwise bald head shouted at them. Hang on, he shouted. The augments calmed down. We just have to wait for the shield to go down, then we will kill them and take the women. Low laughter spread throughout the group as they turned to face the golden wall, blocking their way to Sig and the others. Please, laughed Lucas as he walked up to the golden shield. You are no match for the power of the divine keys. If you were so powerful, chided the augment with the tuft of orange hair, then you would not cower behind your wall. You are not fit. The augments cheered loudly. Lucas smiled. I don't need to be fit, said Lucas confidently, and the fit do not always survive. He raised his hand slowly and snapped his fingers. It did not take them long to realize the snap they heard had not come from the fingers of the boy behind the golden shield. It had come from the chest of the augment with the orange tuft of hair. Blood oozed out of a new wound onto his black leather vest for several seconds. The other augments gasped as he collapsed onto the ground. Silence lasted for another moment before an augment with metal spikes embedded in his hands, arms, and shoulders spoke up. He was obviously not fit, shouted the studded augment. Perhaps you misunderstood me, said Lucas calmly. Fitness is irrelevant. How else could someone my age and size defeat you? Shut up, shouted the studded augment. Lucas raised his fingers again. You can't touch me, shouted the augment. Lucas snapped. Blood spurted out of the chest of the augment and he slumped to the floor. The others seemed to be stunned. Anyone else? Asked Lucas calmly. Just wait till the shield is down, suggested a short woman with a camera embedded in her skull. Lucas snapped again and two large male augments screamed and fell to the ground. Good idea, said Lucas with a snide expression on his face, because it's not like I can kill more than one of you at a time. What do you want? Demanded the female augment. I want you to leave, said Lucas. I want you to abandon this stupid survival of the fittest crap. Blasphemy, whispered the female augment. Lucas raised his fingers. She turned and sprinted away, bringing a smile to Lucas's lips. Anyone else? Asked Lucas confidently. The others turned and rushed after her. Lucas turned around and smiled. Jennifer and Stephanie watched him with wide eyes. As pathetic as he had seemed when he stumbled across them in their underwear, he was that much more impressive after having sent the augments fleeing. How did you do that? Gasped Jennifer as the golden shield dissipated. Their overconfidence, said Lucas with a smile. They believed that they were unstoppable, so it was easy to have Lizard teleport into the dark room from which you were being watched and plant small explosives on them. Lizard teleported behind Lucas. Row 82 said they cleared out, said Lizard. He was worried at first. Lucas's face turned red again. Yeah, sorry about that, muttered Lucas. Sig and Carson laughed. So whatever happened to Alpha 1? Asked Jennifer. Miranda sent her out with a group of augments to raid a hospital, said Carson. I'm sure the other augments will come after her. Won't she come back? Asked Jennifer. No, said Carson confidently. She was always opposed to the Syndicate fording up in a base. That's why she was sponsored in Angelica's tournament, and why she was the first test subject for augmentation. Miranda wanted to get rid of her. Now that she has been defeated, Alpha 1 will run her own program. Jennifer nodded, but then looked at Carson and tilted her head in confusion. What will you do now? Asked Jennifer. I am going to stay here with the love of my life, he said with a smile as he looked down at Angelica. Drool oozed out of her mouth as she breathed. She had seemed impressive, even regal at her Syndicate tournament, and when she had fought against Jennifer and Stephanie. Obviously, having been lobotomized by Miranda Drake, she was only a shell of her former self. For a moment, Jennifer pondered whether it was cruel to allow Carson to keep custody of Angelica. She watched as Carson's eyes seemed to twinkle with happiness. As she considered the scene, she realized that Angelica was no longer able to care for herself, and as unsettling as Carson Price was, he would ensure that Angelica would have all her needs met. You knew this would happen, didn't you? Asked Jennifer. Not everything, said Carson. The future isn't set in stone, you know. He turned back to Lucas. Speaking of which, continued Carson, what will you do now? Everyone turned to face Lucas. He paused for a moment as he thought about everything that had happened after confronting the destroyer in Antarctica, the sinking of their ship, Angelica Sterling's tournament, rescues and captures with the Syndicate, the enigmatic Carson Price, and the final victory over Miranda Drake. None of these events seemed to be forced by destiny or to have some greater purpose. It seemed as though their experiences of late had only been a distraction from what truly mattered. Perhaps some sort of divine providence had led them to be able to endure these difficulties, but endurance did not fill Lucas with a sense of closure. He felt as he had when he had first discovered that Row 82 was a divine key-bearer. He was overwhelmed with the sense that they had been given the divine keys because someone trusted them to use their powers and their judgment to do good. Victor Lee's words returned to Lucas's thoughts. There is no destiny, but there is strategy. We came to this time to make the future better, said Lucas as he turned back to Sig. To save the Golden Age. That's still the plan.